Chapter 1. Jake's Return. Jake Sullivan, exhausted and weary after a long business trip, slowly turned onto his quiet tree-lined street. The sun was already setting, casting a warm glow on the house facades, creating an illusion of peace and tranquility. But as he drove closer to his home, his heart began to race. His father Henry's car was parked in the driveway. Henry rarely visited unannounced, especially when Jake was away. Jake felt a twinge of unease, but decided that maybe his father had just stopped by to check on things, as Jake had asked him to do while he was gone. Still, something didn't feel right. His mind refused to believe it, but his intuition urged him to find out what was going on. Jake turned off the engine and closed his eyes for a moment, trying to calm himself. Maybe it's just a coincidence, he tried to convince himself before stepping out of the car and heading to the house. The silence around him felt ominous. He approached the door, the key in his hand trembling slightly from nervousness. Inside, the house was dark, except for a faint light coming from under the bedroom door on the second floor. Jake knew he had to go there, even though every fiber of his being resisted. As he ascended the stairs, he heard muffled sounds coming from the bedroom. These sounds, low voices occasionally interrupted by strange sighs, made his heart tighten with the foreboding of something terrible. With each step, he felt the dread inside him growing, the anticipation of the inevitable. He slowly pushed open the bedroom door and saw something that turned his world upside down. On the bed before him were his wife Emily, his father Henry, and his younger brother Travis. The scene looked like a bad dream from which Jake couldn't wake up. His body froze and his mind refused to accept the reality of what was happening. But it was real. Emily turned her head, her eyes widening in fear when she saw Jake. A deafening silence filled the room, lasting only a moment but feeling like an eternity. Moving mechanically, Jake pulled out his phone and took several pictures. He didn't know why, but he knew he needed evidence. Evidence that this moment was real, that it had really happened. When his father rose from the bed, Jake took a step back, instinctively reaching with his left hand to his waistband, where a gun was hidden. Emily screamed when she saw the weapon in Jake's hand. "Son, don't do this," Henry croaked, raising his hands in surrender. "You don't understand." But Jake wasn't listening. All his emotions, pain, anger, disappointment, blended into an unbearable cocktail. His gaze locked onto Travis, who was silently watching him, making no attempt to explain or justify himself. "You've always been the favorite," Jake finally spat, aiming the gun at his brother. "But now I'm ending this." The sound of the gunshot shattered the silence. Travis screamed, collapsing to the floor, clutching his shot leg. Blood quickly began to soak into the carpet, creating a ghastly contrast with the room's milky white decor. Emily rushed to Travis, crying and wailing, while Henry took a step forward, but Jake immediately pointed the gun at him. "One more step, and you're next," Jake said hoarsely, barely keeping his voice from shaking. "You've taken everything from me that mattered, but now I'm leaving and you'll no longer control my life." Jake gave them all a cold look, feeling a new wave of anger rising inside him. He no longer belonged to this family. He no longer wanted to be part of their twisted game. "I quit," he added, "and the sign on the company is about to change. No more Sullivan and Sons. It'll just be Sullivan." With those words, he left the room, hearing the cries and pleas behind him. Descending the stairs, Jake grabbed a knife and decisively slashed the tires on his father's car, certain it would delay him long enough. Then he got into his car and drove away, stopping a few blocks later to call his mother. "Mom, you need to see something before Dad gets home," he said, sending the pictures. "It'll change everything." He hung up, feeling a bitter taste rising within him. Jake could never return to that house. He was no longer part of that family. His new life began here and now, and it would belong to him alone. Chapter 2. Family Betrayal. Jake sped down the highway, barely noticing the road ahead, only the flicker of streetlights as if they were the sole witnesses to his swift escape from what he had just left behind. His thoughts whirled chaotically in his mind, offering him no peace. The scene he had just walked away from, betrayal that struck at the very heart of his family, played over and over again in his head. He knew this was the end of everything he had known, loved, and believed in. But it was also the beginning. The only question was, at what cost? Jake sharply turned the wheel and veered off the main highway onto a narrow country road. He couldn't keep driving on the major routes in his current state. He needed some time to process everything that had happened. Pulling over to the side of the road, he turned off the engine and leaned back in his seat, trying to grasp even a shred of calm. But instead, a new wave of anger and disappointment washed over him. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Jake reluctantly pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a message from his mother. "Jake, what does this mean? Henry isn't explaining anything, and these photos, is it true?" He closed his eyes, feeling a surge of rage inside. He didn't want to talk to his mother right now. He knew she deserved an explanation, but he had no idea how to start that conversation. Instead of replying, Jake looked at the photos he had sent again. Everything seemed so unreal, as if it were part of some cheap detective novel. But the truth was worse. His own father, Henry, the man he had once trusted unconditionally, had turned out to be a traitor, and his brother Travis. What had driven him to this? Envy? Jealousy? Or had he always been like this and Jake had just never noticed? His head throbbed with pain. There was no point in searching for answers here on the side of the road. He knew this place had become dangerous for him, not physically but emotionally. He couldn't stay in this city, in this life that suddenly felt alien and hostile. Jake started the car and drove back onto the highway, deciding not to return home. Instead, he headed to the bank. A plan was forming in his mind: leave everything behind and start over. But for that, he needed money. A lot of money. At the bank, when the teller asked him why he needed so much cash, Jake just gave her a stern look. He withdrew everything he could, from personal accounts, from corporate accounts. It was his right as he saw it. It was his inheritance, his severance for the pain they had caused him. He walked out of the bank with a bag full of cash and headed back to his car. But as he sat behind the wheel, he felt a tremor run through his body. He realized this was not just anger. It was something deeper, a thirst for revenge, a need to make them pay for what they had done to his life. He remembered the old documents he had found among his father's things a few months ago, the suspicious deals Henry had been involved in. At the time, he had brushed it off, thinking it was just part of old business transactions that didn't concern him. But now Jake understood it was just the tip of the iceberg. There was more to this, and he was going to get to the bottom of it. Driving out of the city felt like a blur. He knew he needed to disappear for a while to think everything through and devise a plan. But deep down, he understood. This wasn't just an attempt to escape. This was the beginning of the end for his father and everyone else who had stood in Jake's way. They had left him no choice. Henry, Travis, Emily, they had all betrayed him, and now they would pay. Jake turned on the radio, trying to drown out his thoughts. Ahead lay a long road, but instead of fear for the future, he felt determination. He knew he wouldn't stop until he had justice. Only now, justice took on a new meaning, and Jake was ready to play by the new rules. Chapter 3: Escape and Plan for Revenge. Jake's car sped down the deserted highway, leaving behind the city that now felt like a foreign land. His thoughts were focused on his next moves. Leaving his family was only the first step. He understood that a far more dangerous game awaited him ahead. He arrived at a small motel on the outskirts of a neighboring state, a temporary refuge where he could pause and think about his next steps. The modest room with peeling walls and dim lighting didn't offer a sense of security, but for Jake, it was a necessary stop, a place where he could momentarily freeze before taking the next step. Jake tossed the bag of money on the bed and collapsed into a chair, pulling out an old notebook he had found among his father's things months ago. At the time, he had briefly flipped through it, not giving much thought to the strange notes and annotations. But now, understanding the scale of the betrayal, he decided to look at these entries from a different angle. The notes were made in a chaotic manner, as if Henry was trying to encrypt his thoughts and actions so that no one could decipher them. But Jake knew his father well enough to notice patterns. Among the pages were names, dates, sums of money, and vague references to locations that hinted at some hidden dealings. One name kept appearing on the pages: Edward Harris. Jake remembered that this was an old friend of his father, a man who had suddenly disappeared from their lives several years ago. Now he understood that Edward's disappearance was far from accidental. Judging by the notes, Harris had been a key figure in some large scheme, but what exactly had happened between him and Henry remained a mystery. Jake knew he needed more information. Running away with the money wasn't enough to get revenge. He had to expose everything, not just his father, but those behind him. He pulled out his phone and began searching for information on Harris. It took some time to find the right leads. Several articles mentioned that Edward Harris had been involved in large financial frauds and had disappeared after his companies mysteriously went bankrupt. But one article caught Jake's attention in particular. It stated that in the months leading up to his disappearance, Harris had frequently been seen in a small town in the southern part of the country. This was the place Jake decided to head. Gathering his things, Jake once again found himself behind the wheel. His path led through several states, but he knew time was running out. Henry might have already realized that Jake wasn't just running away, he was planning something, and then his father would start to act. Midway to his destination, Jake stopped at a gas station to fill up the tank and grab a coffee. While waiting in line, his attention was drawn to a young woman at the counter. She was arguing with the cashier, trying to pay for her purchase, but her credit card had been declined. Jake noticed her nervous movements and strained voice. At some point, their eyes met, and he saw something in her gaze that he couldn't ignore: fear and desperation. Hesitating only for a moment, Jake approached the counter and offered to pay for her purchases. The woman was surprised at first, but then accepted his offer with gratitude. "Thank you," she said as they stepped outside. "I don't know what I would have done without you." "It's nothing," Jake replied, taking a closer look at her. She looked tired, wearing old jeans and a worn jacket, and her eyes betrayed the hardships she had endured. "Are you all right?" She shrugged as if she was about to lie, but then changed her mind. "I'm just trying to get as far away from my past as I can," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "My name is Madison." "Jake," he replied. "I'm on the road too. If you want, I can give you a ride." She hesitated, but then nodded, as if making a fateful decision. As they drove on, Madison shared her story with Jake. It turned out that her brother had been killed under mysterious circumstances after getting involved in a deal with Henry Sullivan. She had been searching for the truth for a long time and was now trying to escape to save her life. Jake felt a new surge of anger rising inside him. His father hadn't just betrayed him, he had left a trail of blood, ruining the lives of others. Now Jake had not only a personal motive, but also a desire to seek justice. He and Madison decided to work together. Jake knew the risk was great, but he also understood that with her help, he could gather more evidence against his father. Together they devised a plan. First, find Edward Harris, then uncover what had happened between him and Henry, and ultimately expose the entire criminal network. As Jake and Madison neared the state line, he knew there was no turning back. The game had begun, and the stakes were too high to lose. Chapter 4. Dark Family Secrets. The road stretched out before them as a long ribbon of asphalt dissolving into the night. The headlights of Jake's car barely illuminated the path ahead, but that didn't frighten him. On the contrary, the darkness around them seemed to symbolize the unknown that he and Madison were plunging into deeper and deeper. Madison had fallen asleep in the passenger seat, exhausted from the events of the past few days. Jake, on the other hand, was fully focused. His mind was racing with plans and possible scenarios for their next moves. The silence filling the car was necessary for him to organize his thoughts. When they crossed the state line, Jake made the decision to stop for the night in a small roadside motel. He needed a little time to pull everything together and figure out their next steps. Leaving Madison to sleep, Jake returned to the car and pulled out the old notebook his father had left behind. Among the chaotic notes were names of companies, dates, sums of money, all hinting at a hidden world of criminal activity that Henry had kept concealed. It was now clear to Jake that his father's business dealings were not just legitimate transactions. As he leafed through the pages, one name appeared repeatedly: Edward Harris. Jake remembered him as an old associate of his father's who had mysteriously vanished years ago. He realized that Harris must have been involved in something much bigger, something that Henry had tried to bury along with their friendship. Early the next morning, as the first light of dawn began to seep through the motel room curtains, Jake woke Madison. They set off again, this time heading to the southern town where Harris had last been seen. As they neared their destination, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were approaching something dangerous and destructive. He recalled conversations he had overheard as a child, his parents discussing matters they had tried to keep hidden from the children. Back then, it seemed unimportant, but now he understood that those talks were pieces of a larger puzzle. Georgetown greeted them with gray skies and empty streets. It was a typical small town where life moved at its own pace, far from the bustling city centers. Here, Harris could have easily hidden from the world, and Jake felt they were close to uncovering the truth. Finding an old bar on the outskirts mentioned in one of the articles, Jake and Madison stepped inside. The dimly lit interior, thick with the smell of tobacco and cheap alcohol, greeted them with the unfriendly gazes of the locals. Behind the bar stood a tall, burly, middle-aged man who didn't seem thrilled by the sight of new faces. Jake approached the counter and ordered 2 coffees. The bartender gave him a suspicious look but fulfilled the order. Jake knew that Harris might be hiding somewhere nearby and decided to proceed cautiously. "We're looking for someone," Jake began, trying to sound as casual as possible. "Edward Harris. We heard he comes around here." The bartender tensed slightly at the mention of the name, but his face remained impassive. "Nobody here knows that name," he replied curtly, placing the cups on the counter. Jake felt the bartender was hiding something, but he didn't want to raise suspicion. He knew that in places like this you had to tread carefully. "All right," Jake said, pushing one of the cups toward Madison. "If anyone happens to see him, tell him Jake Sullivan is looking for him." The bartender froze for a moment, then nodded and returned to his work. Jake realized he had made the right move. The name Sullivan clearly meant something in this town. But now the question was, how was this name connected to Harris? Leaving the bar, Jake and Madison walked through the town, hoping to find something that would point them in the right direction. It wasn't until they returned to the car that Jake noticed a note tucked under the windshield wiper. He unfolded it, read it, and froze. The note contained just 3 words: "They're watching you." Jake scanned the surroundings, but he didn't see anyone suspicious. Nevertheless, the threat was clear. They were on the right track, but it meant danger was closing in. He knew they had to be ready for anything. The next step was to find Harris, learn the whole truth, and possibly face those who would do anything to stop them. Meanwhile, in another part of the town, in an old house, a figure in the shadows watched them, holding a phone. "Sullivan is here," a quiet voice said down the line. The response was short and cold. "Don't let him leave." Chapter 5. An Unexpected Alliance. They raced down the highway, escaping from those who were willing to do anything to destroy them. Harris's car smoothly accelerated, and in the rearview mirror, Jake could see only the dim lights of the town slowly fading into the night. The documents they had retrieved from the warehouse lay on the back seat, a grim reminder of the dangerous game they had gotten themselves into. When they reached a small town nestled among the hills, Jake decided they needed to stop. They needed rest and a strategy for their next move. Harris turned onto a narrow street that led to an old motel he knew. The place, as he said, was quiet and remote enough that they wouldn't be easily found. "We're here," Harris said, pulling up in front of the motel. "No one will be looking for us in a place like this." Madison looked tired. but there was a determined gleam in her eyes. Jake felt the same. Now that they had the evidence, they couldn't afford to waste the opportunity to seek justice. They rented 2 rooms and settled in. Harris and Jake sat at the table, spreading out the documents they had gathered. Every piece of paper, every note, every name, these could be critical elements in their fight against Henry Sullivan. "We need to go through all of this and figure out what we can use," Harris said, carefully sorting through the papers. "I remember some of these documents, but there may be new details I'm not aware of." Jake nodded and began reviewing the documents as well. Some were complex financial reports, others were convoluted contracts with vague terms. But it all led to one thing: exposing his father's dirty dealings. After several hours, they stumbled upon something that could change everything. It was a contract signed by Henry Sullivan and Edward Harris, outlining the terms of a stock sale for a company. But what was interesting was that on the back of the contract, someone had made notes that were clearly not meant for prying eyes. These notes mentioned large sums of money transferred through offshore accounts and listed the names of people involved in the scheme. "This is it," Harris said after reading the notes. "This is what we need. These names could be the key to bringing down the entire system your father created." Jake felt a new surge of determination. He knew these documents could deliver a fatal blow to his father's empire, but he also understood that Henry wouldn't leave them alone. "We have to move quickly," Jake said. "We have the evidence, but we're still in danger. I'm not sure we can trust the authorities. If Henry and his people find out, they'll find a way to destroy us before the truth comes out." Harris nodded thoughtfully. "There's one person I can trust," Harris said. "His name is Edward Harrison, a former partner of my father, but we always had a good relationship. He now works for the government and might be able to help us safely hand over the documents." Jake agreed. It was a risky chance, but it was their best shot. They contacted Harrison, explained the situation, and arranged a meeting in a neutral location to hand over the evidence. However, as they were discussing the details, there was a knock on Jake's door. He tensed, feeling a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Approaching the door, he cautiously looked through the peephole and saw a figure dressed in dark clothing. "Who could that be?" Madison whispered, clutching Jake's hand. "I don't know," Jake whispered back, holding his gun ready. Jake slowly opened the door, prepared for anything. But instead of an enemy, he saw an old acquaintance, Edward Harrison. "I hope I didn't startle you," Harrison said as he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "I found out you were staying here and decided to act quickly to avoid unnecessary attention." "How did you find us?" Jake asked, surprised. "I have my sources," Harrison replied with a slight smile. "And now that I'm here, we need to discuss how we're going to hand over these documents. But you should know, in this case, nothing is as simple as it seems. Henry Sullivan isn't the only enemy you'll have to face." Jake and Madison exchanged anxious glances. Harrison continued. "There are people involved in this who are willing to do anything to keep the truth hidden. You need to be ready for them to strike at any moment. But if we act quickly and decisively, we have a chance." They arranged to meet the next day in an abandoned building outside the city, where Harrison promised to ensure their safety. But after Harrison left, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that it had all been too easy. He suspected that someone was leading them down a false path. "We have to be ready for anything," Jake said, looking at Madison and Harris. "If something goes wrong, we need to be prepared to fight." They spent the rest of the night preparing for the meeting, knowing it could be their only chance to finish what they had started. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something far more dangerous than they had imagined lay ahead. When dawn colored the sky over the hills, they were ready for the decisive day that could bring an end to this dangerous game. Chapter 6. On the Edge of Danger. Night had fallen over Georgetown, and the narrow streets of the town were shrouded in darkness. Jake, Madison, and Harris moved cautiously through one of the alleys, trying to stay in the shadows. Ahead of them awaited another encounter with danger, and they knew that this moment could decide everything. After Harris shared the information about Henry's past, they devised a plan. They needed to reach one of Henry's secret warehouses, where documents compromising Henry and his partners were stored. These documents could serve as key evidence against him if they could retrieve and deliver them to the authorities. But the path there was dangerous, and Jake understood that every step they took was being watched. "We're close," Harris whispered, stopping by the wall of one of the abandoned buildings. "This warehouse is the last place I saw the documents. Henry used it to store all his important papers and money." Jake looked around, and his attention was drawn to a large door leading inside the warehouse. In the darkness, it was almost invisible, but Jake knew that something crucial lay behind it. "We need to move quickly," he said, looking at Harris and Madison. "We don't know how much time we have before Henry or one of his men notices us." Harris nodded and quietly began to pick the lock, which was old and rusty but still secure. Madison, nervously looking around, kept watch, ready to alert them to any danger. Finally, after a few tense minutes, the lock gave way and the door creaked open. Inside, it was dark and smelled of mold. Jake was the first to enter the warehouse, followed by Madison and Harris. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they saw rows of shelves stacked with boxes, folders, and crates. This was a treasure trove of information hidden from prying eyes. Harris pointed to a crate in the far corner. "Over there," he whispered. "The key documents are in that crate. If they're still there, we can use them." Jake moved towards the indicated spot but suddenly stopped, hearing a faint noise outside the warehouse door. He froze, trying to listen, and after a few seconds realized that someone was approaching. They were not alone. "Quick, grab the documents," he ordered Harris and Madison, pulling out his gun. "I'll cover you." Harris quickly began rummaging through the crate, pulling out folders and papers and handing them to Madison. Time was working against them, and Jake knew it well. The noise outside grew louder, and soon they heard footsteps echoing at the warehouse doors. "Someone's coming," Madison whispered, barely holding back panic. Jake raised his gun, aiming it at the door, and motioned for them to hurry. Time was running out. The warehouse door suddenly burst open, and a bright flashlight beam cut through the darkness. Jake fired first, aiming at the person with the flashlight. There was a scream, and the flashlight fell to the ground, illuminating a group of armed men storming inside. Jake quickly assessed the situation. There were 4 of them, and they were well armed. "Get back!" one of them shouted, pointing an automatic rifle at Jake. "You're surrounded!" But Jake wasn't about to surrender. He fired again, hitting one of the attackers, who fell to the ground. At that moment, Harris, having grabbed all the necessary documents, rushed to the back exit of the warehouse. "Run!" Jake shouted, covering their retreat. He continued shooting, trying to keep the attackers at a distance, but there were too many of them. One of the attackers charged at him from behind, and Jake barely managed to fend him off, but he took a hard hit to the head, momentarily losing consciousness. When he came to, he saw that they were surrounded and ready to be captured. But at that moment, Harris, who had already made it outside, returned and threw a smoke grenade into the warehouse. The room quickly filled with thick white smoke, disorienting everyone inside. "Jake, over here!" Harris shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him outside. They ran through the back door and sprinted towards the car where Madison was already waiting. Jake started the engine, and they sped away at full speed, leaving their pursuers behind. The car raced down narrow streets, and none of them looked back. Harris was breathing heavily, still clutching the documents in his hands. "We did it," he exhaled with relief. "But now they know we've gone too far," Jake replied, his eyes fixed on the road. "We're now their top priority." Madison squeezed his hand in silence, showing that they were in this together. Ahead of them lay even greater danger, but now they had something worth fighting for. They had the documents that could bring down Henry Sullivan's entire empire. But the question remained, could they use them before they were found? The city lights of another town appeared on the horizon, where they hoped to find refuge, at least for a while. But Jake knew that every step they took would now be tracked. In the game they had started, the stakes were even higher, and any mistake could cost them their lives. Chapter 7. Revealing the traitors. They sped down the highway, evading those who were willing to go to any lengths to eliminate them. Harris's car surged forward, and in the rearview mirror, Jake saw only the fading lights of the city slowly disappearing into the night. The documents they had retrieved from the warehouse lay on the back seat, serving as a grim reminder of the dangerous game they were now deeply entangled in. When they reached a small town nestled among the hills, Jake decided they needed to stop. They needed rest and a plan for what to do next. Harris turned onto a narrow street leading to an old motel he was familiar with. It was a place quiet and remote enough that no one would easily find them there. "We're here," Harris said, stopping the car in front of the motel. "No one will be looking for us in a place like this." Madison looked exhausted, but her eyes still gleamed with determination. Jake felt the same. Now that they had the evidence, they couldn't afford to waste the opportunity to bring Henry Sullivan to justice. They rented 2 rooms and settled in. Harris and Jake sat down at a table, spreading out the documents they had gathered. Every piece of paper, every note, every name, each one could be a critical element in their fight against Henry Sullivan. "We need to sort through all of this and figure out what we can use," Harris said, carefully sifting through the papers. "I remember some of these documents, but there might be new details I don't know about." Jake nodded and began reviewing the documents as well. Some were complex financial reports, others were convoluted contracts with obscure terms. But everything pointed to one thing: exposing his father's criminal activities. After several hours of sifting through the documents, they came across something that could change everything. It was a contract signed by Henry Sullivan and Edward Harris, outlining the terms of a stock sale for a company. But what caught their attention was the back of the contract, where someone had made notes that were clearly not intended for public eyes. These notes mentioned large sums of money transferred through offshore accounts and listed the names of people involved in the scheme. "This is it," Harris said after reading the notes. "This is what we need. These names could be the key to bringing down the entire system your father built." Jake felt a renewed surge of determination. He knew these documents could deliver a fatal blow to his father's empire, but he also understood that Henry wouldn't let them go unchallenged. "We need to move quickly," Jake said. "We have the evidence, but we're still in danger. I'm not sure we can trust the authorities. If Henry and his people find out about this, they'll find a way to destroy us before the truth comes out." Harris nodded thoughtfully. "There's one person I can trust," Harris said. "His name is Edward Harrison, a former partner of my father, but we've always had a good relationship. He now works for the government and might be able to help us safely hand over the documents." Jake agreed. It was a risky chance, but it was their best option. They contacted Harrison, explained the situation, and arranged a meeting in a neutral location to hand over the evidence. However, as they were discussing the details, there was a knock at Jake's door. He tensed, feeling a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Approaching the door, he cautiously looked through the peephole and saw a figure dressed in dark clothing. "Who could that be?" Madison whispered, clutching Jake's hand. "I don't know," Jake whispered back, holding his gun at the ready. Jake slowly opened the door, prepared for anything, but instead of an enemy, he saw an old acquaintance, Edward Harrison. "I hope I didn't startle you," Harrison said as he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "I found out you were staying here and decided to act quickly to avoid unnecessary attention." "How did you find us?" Jake asked, surprised. "I have my sources," Harrison replied with a slight smile. "And now that I'm here, we need to discuss how we're going to hand over these documents. But you should know, in this case, nothing is as simple as it seems. Henry Sullivan isn't the only enemy you'll have to face." Jake and Madison exchanged anxious glances. Harrison continued, "There are people involved in this who are willing to do anything to keep the truth hidden. You need to be prepared for them to strike at any moment, but if we act quickly and decisively, we have a chance." They arranged to meet the next day in an abandoned building outside the city, where Harrison promised to ensure their safety. However, after Harrison left, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that it had all been too easy. He suspected that someone was leading them down a false path. "We have to be ready for anything," Jake said, looking at Madison and Harris. "If something goes wrong, we need to be prepared to fight." They spent the rest of the night preparing for the meeting, knowing it could be their only chance to finish what they had started. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something far more dangerous than they had imagined lay ahead. When dawn colored the sky over the hills, they were ready for the decisive day that could bring an end to this dangerous game. Chapter 8. False Friends and Unexpected Enemies. The next morning, Jake, Madison, and Harris left the motel before sunrise. They were on their way to meet Harrison, a meeting that could determine the fate of their entire operation. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had been with him since their last conversation. The road to the meeting place wound through a wooded area. The air was fresh and cold, and the morning fog curled around the ground, creating an eerie and uncertain atmosphere. Harris's car moved slowly along the twisting path, and with each passing mile, they drew closer to the moment when everything would be decided. The abandoned building where they had agreed to meet was deep in the woods, far from prying eyes. When they arrived, Jake saw an old factory with shattered windows and peeling paint on the walls. The place seemed perfect for a secret meeting, but at the same time it filled him with a sense of danger. "Keep your guard up," Jake warned Harris and Madison as he stepped out of the car. "We don't know what to expect inside." Madison and Harris nodded, and the three of them headed toward the building. The entrance to the factory was deserted, but the doors were slightly ajar, as if someone was expecting them. When they entered, the light from their flashlights illuminated the vast empty hall where a heavy silence reigned. Only the echo of their footsteps reverberated off the walls, intensifying the tension. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Madison whispered, looking around. "Yes," Harris replied, though his voice carried a hint of doubt. "Harrison should already be here." They moved deeper into the building, but soon noticed something was wrong. In the corner of the hall, Jake spotted several dark figures, and his heart began to race. He raised his gun and aimed it toward the strangers. "Who's there?" he shouted, trying to mask the tension in his voice. One of the figures stepped into the light. It was Harrison, but his face was serious and cold, completely unlike the man Jake remembered. Behind him stood several more men, all armed and clearly not there for a peaceful conversation. "What's going on?" Jake asked, his voice filled with suspicion as he glanced back at Madison and Harris, who were also preparing for the worst. "Jake, there's something I need to tell you," Harrison began, his voice devoid of the warmth it once had. "This situation is much more complicated than you realize. There are forces at play here that you can't even begin to comprehend." "What are you talking about?" Jake demanded, not lowering his weapon. "Henry Sullivan isn't the only player in this game," Harrison continued. "There are those far more powerful than him, and they're willing to do anything to keep their secrets safe. I was supposed to prevent a disaster, but now things have spiraled out of control." Jake realized they had walked into a trap. Harrison, the man they had trusted, was actually in league with those who were pulling the strings behind the scenes. It was a betrayal Jake hadn't seen coming. "You knew this the whole time?" Jake asked, barely able to contain his anger. "You brought us here to hand us over to them?" "I didn't have a choice," Harrison replied, his face strained. "If I didn't do this, they would have killed us all. But now we still have a chance to get out of this if you give me the documents." Jake felt a wave of rage and disappointment surge inside him. He knew he was in a critical situation where any decision could cost him and his allies their lives. But before he could respond, a shot rang out. One of Harrison's men collapsed to the ground, and in the next instant, chaos erupted. Harris fired first, aiming at Harrison's men, and Jake quickly followed suit. Madison took cover behind some old crates, firing at anyone who tried to approach. The sound of gunfire echoed through the hall as Jake fought to keep the attackers at bay. But there were too many of them, and the situation was quickly becoming hopeless. "Let's get out of here," Harris shouted, covering their retreat. They began to retreat toward the exit, fighting off the attackers. Harris, acting decisively, grabbed one of the boxes of documents and made a dash for the door. Jake and Madison followed, but just as they were about to make it outside, Harrison lunged at Jake, trying to snatch the documents from him. The struggle was fierce and brief. Jake used all his strength to push Harrison away, but Harrison was stronger, and the document slipped from Jake's grasp. Harrison managed to grab the folder and attempted to flee, but in that moment Harris shot him, hitting him in the shoulder. Harrison fell to the ground, clutching his wound while the documents scattered around him. Jake quickly gathered them up and nodded to Madison and Harris. "We need to go," he said, his voice resolute. "We can't stay here." They fled the building and jumped into the car, where Harris sped away down the forest road. Ahead was another town and new plans. Jake knew they were in even greater danger than before, but he also understood that there was no turning back. As they drove out onto the main road, Harris sighed heavily. "We barely made it out," he said, looking at Jake. "But now we have the documents, and we need to find a secure way to use them." "We'll find a way," Jake replied, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "But now we know our enemies are closer than we thought. We can't trust anyone anymore." They continued driving, leaving behind the ruined factory and Harrison, who had betrayed them for his own gain. Ahead lay an even more dangerous game, and the stakes continued to rise. Chapter 9. Confrontation with the Father. After a harrowing night filled with betrayals and danger, Jake, Madison, and Harris drove toward the city where they hoped to find refuge and a chance to continue their fight. But all three knew that with each passing mile, their chances of success were diminishing. The enemies were closer than they thought, and now they couldn't trust anyone. They stopped at a gas station to refuel and take a short break. Harris was the first to step out to buy something to eat, while Jake stayed in the car, staring out the window at the deserted highway. His thoughts were consumed by one thing: the impending confrontation with Henry. He knew that the final showdown was inevitable. "Jake, we need to decide what to do next," Madison said quietly, breaking his thoughts. "We can't just keep running. We need to find a way to stop your father." Jake nodded, still staring out at the road. "I know," he said, "but the problem is, we don't know who our real enemy is. There are too many players in this game, and Henry is just the tip of the iceberg." Madison fell silent, understanding that Jake was right. They had been drawn into a complex web of intrigue, and now there was almost no way out. When Harris returned with the food, they decided to continue their journey. Jake suggested heading to the city where Henry Sullivan's main office was located. He knew that it was there they could find him and perhaps finally bring an end to this nightmare. The drive to the city took several hours, but as they approached the business district, the tension in the car became almost palpable. Jake knew that the final confrontation with his father would be difficult, but he also understood that it was their only chance to put an end to all of this. They parked on the street and stepped out of the car. The evening city was bustling with people going about their business, but for Jake, this moment felt like the calm before the storm. He took a deep breath and headed toward his father's office, knowing there was no turning back. The building that housed Henry Sullivan's office was one of the tallest in the city. Several guards stood at the entrance, and Jake realized that getting in wouldn't be easy. "We need to do this quickly," he whispered to Harris and Madison. "They might recognize us." "There's another entrance through the underground garage," Harris suggested. "I know someone there who can help us get in." They headed to the garage, where Harris approached a security guard and exchanged a few words with him. The guard, fortunately, turned out to be an old acquaintance of Harris and let them through without any questions. When they took the elevator to the necessary floor, Jake felt adrenaline coursing through his veins. They stepped out into an empty hallway, dimly lit by soft lights, and moved toward Henry's office. The door was slightly ajar, and Jake could hear his father's familiar voice talking to someone on the phone. Jake signaled the others to stop, then quietly approached the door, listening to the conversation. "They're already close," Henry was saying. "We need to be ready. I won't let them destroy everything I've built." Jake felt a surge of anger. He gathered all his resolve and pushed the door open, stepping into the office. Henry, seeing his son, immediately fell silent and slowly put down the phone. "Jake," he said, his voice cold and steady, "I knew you would come." "This was bound to happen," Jake replied, holding his gun at the ready. "I know everything, Father. I know about your dealings, about how you used me, how you betrayed our family." Henry slowly rose from his desk, his face remaining calm, but Jake could see the tension in his eyes. "You don't understand the whole picture," Henry began. "This isn't just business. It's politics, it's power. If you destroy this, you'll destroy not just me, but yourself as well." "That's no excuse," Jake replied coldly. "You were willing to sacrifice everyone for your own gain, but now you'll pay for it." Henry smirked. "And what are you going to do, Jake? Kill me? Are you ready to take on that responsibility? Do you think the world will be better off if I'm gone? Someone else will take my place, and everything will repeat itself." At that moment, Harris and Madison entered the office. Harris was holding the documents they had collected and handed them to Henry. "This is the end, Henry," Harris said. "We have everything we need to destroy your empire. These documents prove your guilt. You can't escape justice." Henry froze for a moment, studying the documents. Then he slowly lifted his gaze to Jake. "Do you really think it's that simple?" he asked. "You're too naive, Jake. These documents are just a small part of what I've done. You'll never know the full truth." Jake felt a surge of anger boiling inside him. He raised his gun and pointed it directly at his father. "It doesn't matter," he said. "I came here to end this. I won't let you continue to destroy people's lives." Henry smirked and took a step forward. "Then shoot, son," he said. "Do it. Let's finish this once and for all." Madison tried to stop Jake, but he had already made his decision. In that moment, when everything seemed to reach its climax, a shot rang out. But the bullet didn't hit Henry. One of Henry's men, who had been standing behind the door, fired first, but at that same instant, Jake also pulled the trigger. Henry collapsed to the floor, clutching his chest, while the man who had fired first fell to the ground, struck by Harris's bullet. The office was filled with a deafening silence, broken only by Jake's heavy breathing. He stared at his father's body, unable to believe what had just happened. "Jake, we need to leave," Madison said quietly, coming up to him and placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's not safe to stay here." Jake slowly lowered the gun and nodded. They quickly gathered the documents and left the office, leaving behind Henry Sullivan's dead body and his ruined empire. As they rushed out of the building and jumped into the car, Jake felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had just killed his father, and now he would have to live with that for the rest of his life. But he also knew that it was the only way to stop the darkness that had consumed their family. Now, he had to find a new path, one free from the past, and start a new life where there would be no room for lies and betrayal. As they left the city, leaving behind the smoldering ruins of their old life, Jake knew that more challenges lay ahead, but he was ready to face them. He knew that from now on, he was in control of his own destiny. Chapter 10. The Final Twist. After all the turmoil and danger, Jake, Madison, and Harris drove away from the city that had been the battleground for their final confrontation. Henry Sullivan was dead, his empire was crumbling, and the documents they had collected were now in the hands of the authorities. It seemed that everything was finally over. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. He tried to understand what was bothering him, but his thoughts were jumbled. Outside the car, the first light of dawn began to illuminate the horizon, bringing with it a new day and, as he hoped, a new life. Madison, sitting in the passenger seat, glanced at Jake with a slight smile. "It's over, Jake," she said softly. "We did it. Now we can start fresh." Jake nodded, but the sense of unease wouldn't leave him. He knew that this should be the end of the story, but something inside him resisted that idea. Harris, who was driving, suddenly slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. He turned off the engine and faced Jake and Madison. "There's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice tense. "I've been trying to protect you this whole time, but there's one thing you need to know before this is all truly over." Jake frowned, his unease growing stronger. "What is it?" he asked. Harris hesitated for a moment, then continued. "When I said that Henry Sullivan wasn't the only player in this game, I meant that there's someone else, someone who's been behind everything from the very beginning. Henry was just a puppet, used to achieve much larger goals." Madison furrowed her brow, trying to grasp what he was saying. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice trembling with tension. Harris slowly lifted his eyes and looked directly at Jake. "It's you, Jake," he said quietly. "It's always been you." Jake recoiled, unable to believe what he was hearing. "What nonsense are you talking about?" he shouted. "I was never part of this." "You don't understand," Harris sighed. "Your memory, it was altered. You were part of this game from the very beginning. Your involvement was crucial. Henry used you because he knew you would never remember who you really were." Madison froze, struggling to process what she was hearing. "But that's impossible," she began. "When you first discovered Henry's secret dealings," Harris continued, ignoring her words, "you tried to stop him. But then those who were higher up decided to use you. They erased part of your memories so you wouldn't remember who you really were. They knew that one day you would start digging deeper, and that's what led us here." Jake felt as if the world around him was collapsing. The memories that had seemed so clear now became blurry and doubtful. He tried to recall his past, but there was only fog in his mind. Everything he knew about himself now seemed like a lie. Jake began, his voice trembling. "This can't be true. I would never have done this." Harris shook his head. "You were one of the best, Jake. You created most of the schemes that Henry used. You helped him build this empire, but when you realized how destructive it was, you tried to tear it down. That's why they altered your memory. They made you a pawn in their game." Madison, still shocked, suddenly grabbed Jake's hand. "This can't be true," she whispered. "Jake, you're not like that." But Jake was already beginning to realize that Harris was telling the truth. The feeling of loss that he had been carrying all this time now made sense. He had indeed been part of all this. But now, remembering who he really was, he understood that this was his chance to set things right. "And what now?" he asked, looking at Harris. Harris sighed. "Now you have a choice. You can try to run, but they'll find you eventually. Or you can use your knowledge to finally destroy what you helped create. But know this, Jake, the price will be high." Jake knew he had no other choice. He had to destroy what he had once helped build, and if that meant sacrificing himself, he was ready. "I'll do it," he said at last with determination in his voice. "I'll destroy them." Harris nodded, and Madison, though filled with fear, supported his decision. They knew that ahead of them lay one last battle, and the stakes would be higher than ever before. They returned to the city where Jake, with the help of Harris and Madison, began to execute his plan. They infiltrated the main data storage of the corporation, using all of Jake's knowledge about the security systems he had once helped design. Jake uploaded a virus that would destroy all traces of the existence of this criminal network. When everything was ready, Jake looked at Harris and Madison. "Thank you," he said, feeling that this was his final goodbye. "We'll do this together," Madison said firmly, but Jake knew this was his personal cross to bear. He activated the program, and moments later, the system began to self-destruct. The algorithms he had once helped create were now destroying themselves from within. In the last moment, when everything was about to be finished, Jake looked at the screen and saw his own reflection. He remembered who he had been and who he had become. And in that moment, he realized that true freedom comes only through sacrifice. An explosion echoed through the building, destroying everything connected to Henry Sullivan's criminal network. Jake Sullivan, The man who had been part of this darkness had now become its destroyer. When the smoke cleared, Madison and Harris stood outside looking at the ruins. They knew that Jake had sacrificed himself for their future, and now they had to continue his mission, keeping his memory alive as a man who chose the right path, even if it cost him his life. The world they knew had changed forever, and although Jake was gone, his sacrifice had freed them from the past, opening the door to a new future where there would be no place for darkness.